computer. Jim Allen.
Thanks, Bev. So before introducing our two speakers, I want to say thank you to you, Bev, for your work in organizing and advertising this event, for all the logistical support. I can say as the chair of SWAN, the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network, that the partnership we have with your organization, Arizona Community Tree Council, which you direct, is really, really vital to the success of our organization. I'd also like to thank you, Andy Mason and Mick O'Neill, for your work in lining up the continuing education credits, which I hope many of you are here to partake in. Those three helped respectively with the International Society of Arboriculture, the Society of American Foresters, and the Agronomy Society of America CEU credits. I'd also like to say a quick word about our organization, Southwest Agroforestry Action Network, which we call SWAN. We're a relatively small and new organization. We've only been around about 3 years now. Our purpose is threefold. First of all, to share information and connect potential collaborators and partners, to help generate ideas, research, and other kinds of agroforestry initiatives, and to increase adoption in the Southwest by a wide range of people in both rural and urban areas. We really hope that this event will help achieve all three of these goals for us and for you. We're really excited about it. This is the first really big event of this type that we've tried to hold so far. SWAN takes a really broad view of what agroforestry is, what I like to call a big tent approach to it. We include all of the more traditional practices that are often looked at as being agroforestry, things like windbreaks, riparian buffers, silvopasture, alley cropping. But we also incorporate into our group people that are interested in permaculture, food forests, and other probably less traditional agroforestry practices. This is really reflected in the diversity of our organization, which is up to about 80 individuals. If you are not already a member and are interested in joining, I think a good step would be to explore our website. Rather than try to give you the URL, I'll just say that it's really easy to find if you Google SWAN with 2 A's and agroforestry, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. At least it's the first thing that comes up for me. So now I'd like to turn to our speakers and introduce them. The first being Audrey. Ann has a master's degree in water resources administration from the University of Arizona. Also has advanced training in sustainable design and extensive experience in rainwater harvesting and habitat restoration. She is the chair of the LEAF Network Steering Committee, which you'll learn more about, and oversaw the development of a website, guidebook, and database to help people choose, plant, care for, harvest edible trees throughout Arizona. She's also the current vice chair of the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network. Rafael grew up in the foothills of the Santa Maria Mountains, northwest of Prescott. She received her doctorate in geography from the University of Arizona with a special focus on arid land science, desert oases, perennial fruit species, and agricultural biogeography. If you haven't read any of her papers, she's done her PhD work based in Baja, was just really, really interesting. She's traveled widely, and her writing has been published in both literary and scientific journals. She lives with her husband and 2 children in Skull Valley, Arizona, where they are raising horses, cattle, and promoting edible forests. I first met these two, Ann and Rafael, about 3 years ago while I was attending several of their LEAF events. I went to a total of 3 of them. Having gotten to know these two, I can say that these brief bios that I just read to you only scratch the surface of the experience and talents that these two have. Those kind of talents that they have range from the practical, things like grafting fruit trees, to the artistic and literary. We're really, really fortunate to have these 2 individuals here today. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to our first speaker, Audrey. And as I understand it, these 2 presentations are pre-recorded just to help ensure that they work technologically. but they're both here with us and will be monitoring the chat box for questions, and we'll be happy to answer them during the Q&A. So I'd like to go ahead and ask Bev to bring up the slides for Anne's presentation.
Rafael de Granada and I are with the LEAF Network, linking edible Arizona forest. The presentation today is based on Growing Edible Arizona Forests, a guidebook that is available at our website, leafnetworkaz.org. You can go to the website and download this guide. In addition, we have sections in the website with extended guide chapters, photos, tables, and resources, some of which you will see during this presentation. And do check out the Arizona Edible Tree Directory, where you can search for 55 edible trees and look at information about edible understory plants. Edible trees are those that produce edible fruits, nuts, seeds, and pods. And there are both native edible trees in Arizona and non-native edible trees. The natives are often low water use, they're tasty and nutritious, they're disease resistant, and they're beneficial to native wildlife and insects and birds. But there's a lot of introduced edible species too that are more familiar to you because you can see some of this produce in the grocery store. Here's just a sample of the edible trees that grow in Arizona. And in our website, we address types of trees, not specific varieties. So when you go to the edible tree directory, you'll get information in general about cherries and pecans and olives and oaks. Different elevations in Arizona can support different groups of edible trees. So you see here a chart showing elevation ranges across Arizona and the edible trees that will grow in those areas. There are varieties, however, that can cover a lot of different areas. So if you look at apple, you'll see you can find an apple variety that will grow pretty much anywhere in Arizona. We also have information about water use and chill hours. Chill hour requirements are the number of accumulated hours between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 degrees Fahrenheit that some trees need in order to stimulate proper bud growth. And trees that need chill hours over 600 hours or more are suited for high plateaus and high mountain areas. Low chill varieties below 600 hours grow best in low, medium, and high elevation deserts in Arizona. Trees have a wide variety of lifespans. If you look at the chart below, you'll see that apples live from 50 to 150 years. Some mulberries live 300 years. So when you acquire a tree, plan ahead for its lifespan because you might not be there to do maintenance throughout its life. So make a record of the type of tree, what kind of care it needs, so that future tree stewards know what to do. Now, edible trees don't necessarily bear in the first year, most do not. So here's a table showing the years to bearing before a tree will start producing produce. All of these tables and charts and this information is all at our website. So I'm going through it quickly today because you'll be able to view this PowerPoint again online at the SWAN website. And I just want to introduce you to the resources that we have. Tree sizes vary considerably as well. You'll see here a chart of canopy diameter and height for selected standard trees. And quite a bit of variation there. So when you plant a tree, be sure you plan for its ultimate canopy width and height. Standard trees are those that grow 15 feet or taller. Dwarf and semi-dwarf trees, semi-dwarf grow 12 to 15 feet high, dwarf grow 8 to 10 feet high. The fruit is the same size, but there will not be as many individual fruits on the tree. They do require less water because they have less canopy area and they produce at a younger age. They're certainly easier to reach, to prune and cover for frost and to harvest the fruit, but they have small root systems, so they might need more food. I might also need to be staked or supported, and they tend to have a shorter lifespan. When you decide to acquire an edible tree, you want to know how it's pollinated so you can ensure that you get fruit. Some trees self-pollinate, some cross-pollinate, which means that they are pollinated by another tree of the same variety. So for example, for apples, you would need more than one apple in your vicinity in order to get cross-pollination. Some are wind-pollinated. Some require animals to do the job, and these trees should be planted within 100 feet of each other if you require animal pollination or insect pollination. And some trees are either male or female. So, for example, for date palms, if you want fruit, be sure to get a female plant. When you go to decide where to put your tree, you want to understand your site very well. So we encourage you to observe your site by walking around it a lot. You may have a plot plan that you can do a design on, and be sure you know where your utilities are. You're going to want to know a lot about the microclimates at your site. For example, sun and shade are extremely important in Arizona. You'll see the summer shade pattern and sun pattern here in this graphic, and the winter pattern. Certain trees should be placed relative to either shade or sun, depending on their tolerance. Soil is really important, and of course in Arizona, we don't have a lot of very rich soil. So if you're just planting native edible trees, they are pretty tolerant of about any soil. Fruit trees that are non-native will need 3 feet of well-drained soil and added organic material. You can do a shake test to find out what your distribution of silt, clay, and sand, in addition to organic material, which in a shake test will float to the top. Cold air drainage is a big factor in Arizona. Trees that need chill hours should be placed at the bottom of drainages where cold air pools. Trees that are frost sensitive should be placed on slopes, preferably west facing or southwest facing, so the cold air drains away and they get plenty of warmth in the winter. Wind can be extremely forceful in Arizona, and it will tend to flag trees. The prevailing wind, which is generally in Arizona, it's the April, May, June pre-monsoonal wind pattern, can actually flag some trees, and you see here examples. So don't place tender fruit trees in an area where they're going to get the brunt of that wind. Put them downwind of a windbreak or downwind of a building, someplace where they'll get some relief from the strong desiccating winds. Space your trees appropriately. Stay at least 2 feet from buildings, walls, and curbs, and probably quite a bit farther than that. Lay your trees out with paths to access them so you can get to them to harvest. We talked about the pollination distances. Make sure that you have enough space between trees to allow for their full canopy growth. And go ahead and interplant with your overstory edible trees with midstory and understory to get more diverse and productive systems. Now, you're looking here at charts showing the dark green is high water use trees. They need 30 to 50 inches of water per year. Medium water use trees are the yellowish green. They need 20 to 40 inches. Low water use trees, which include natives, are 12 to 20 inches. And then the blue line on these graphs shows average monthly rainfall. So you're looking at monthly plant water demand for 3 different water use type trees and monthly rainfall. And we have different locations in Arizona to illustrate the discrepancy between monthly rainfall and plant water demand. One important note on this is when you look at low water use trees, Those include both native and non-native trees, and that's why you see that in a lot of areas where native trees do not need supplemental water, our graph of low water use trees actually exceeds rainfall, because that includes trees from low water use trees from Australia and South America and other arid locations, and they are not adapted to our Arizona seasonal rainfall patterns, but the native desert trees are. So what are you going to do about this discrepancy between water needs and water supply? We highly recommend you harvest rainwater and other non-potable water sources to support your trees. And we're going to talk about both earthworks and tanks for harvesting rainwater. And I'm just going to flip through fairly quickly some illustrations of how water can be harvested. You can harvest it directly just by creating an indentation in the ground. You can put a micro basin on a slope so it captures some local runoff. And working with paths, raising them relative to adjacent water harvesting basins is a really sensible way to create water harvesting. To raise the path, you just dig the dirt out of the basin, put it on the ground. You can pave over it or just add dirt, and you have an instant water harvesting system. When you have gentle broad-scale slopes, you can harvest water in swales. These are linear berms built along the contour line, so when it rains, water is captured throughout that contour line. It's very important to create overflow spillways when you're harvesting across the broad landscape, because you are going to get too much water sometimes, and some of that's going to overflow. And if you don't create a spillway for it to overflow through, it's going to pick its own. Be sure to mulch plants in Arizona. In the upper picture, you see bark mulch under a fig tree. Mulch substantially reduces the amount of evaporation loss from bare soil, and organic mulch in particular builds the soil quality, suppresses weeds, and cools the soil temperature. You can use inorganic mulch in Arizona, but it's going to be pretty hot, so until your trees or your shrubs are grown up, it's going to be a difficult environment for plants, but some plants are hardy enough to do it. You can harvest rainwater in tanks. Here's a number of different configurations and many different sizes and materials for tanks. There's more about this at the website. Be sure when you harvest water that you manage the flow path from the top of your watershed, which in most urban environments is going to be the top of the roof, and you capture water at multiple locations all down the flow path. The longer your flow path of water, the more chance for that water to infiltrate, and it's particularly helpful to have a tank to collect the initial rainfall. Eventually, you will need to overflow it. These graphics is courtesy of Brad Lancaster's Harvesting Rainwater books, and you can find more about that at his website, harvestingrainwater.com. Stormwater harvesting is really important in cities because this water is abundant, and if you don't manage it well, it can create flooding and erosion, and it carries a lot of pollutants off the urban environment into the washes. Lots and lots of hardscape in the urban environment to capture water from, that's for sure. Roofs, patios, parking lots. When you do capture urban runoff, there's a catchment ratio where the number of units of rainfall falling on your plant from the runoff surfaces and from direct rainfall helps you to understand what plants you can provide there. So you see here on the top a 3-to-1 catchment ratio, which is probably adequate to support native trees and some other low water use trees that are not native in medium desert elevations and high desert elevations. In low desert elevations like Phoenix and Yuma, you may need a much higher catchment ratio, not as high as 10-to-1. But you see here that actually in our urban environment, There are many locations where you may have a 10-to-1 catchment ratio. This provides a whole lot of water to your plants, and it's really a great asset. Some people are harvesting stormwater runoff along streets, and here you see a variety of illustrations of curb cuts being captured in basins, most typically in the public right-of-way. And these are a great way to support urban street trees, many of which can be edible. And here you see an example. This is a desert ironwood, which is an edible tree, an edible native. Now, some trees want to be in the canopy or in the basin. Mesquites and things like that can tolerate. Some trees, it's better to have them next to it. You do want a nice wide path for pedestrians, and you want to keep these trees pruned so that it's a good environment for people to walk. Here's an example of broad-scale water harvesting. On the left, you see Sonoran co-housing community in Tucson, and on the right, literally on the right, because this is an aerial photo, is a standard apartment complex. And you can just look at the huge amount of hardscape, particularly on the right, and yet the dearth of tree canopy. Whereas on the left, at Sonoran co-housing, the entire landscape is created with water retention basins, and they also irrigate with gray water and air conditioning condensate. So it's a great example of the difference you can create in terms of shade canopy and edible tree produce and understory edible produce just by harvesting water that's free and non-potable. Now, when you do harvest water off of parking lots, you are collecting asphalt, breakdown products, etc. So this goes in to the soil where microbes break it down, and trees are perfectly happy to use the water from these sources. And by collecting this water before it gets to the regional rivers, you are keeping this stuff out of sandy bottomed washes where it could quickly infiltrate without biological treatment and make its way to shallow water tables. Do not put stormwater directly in contact with edible fruits, nuts, seeds, and pods. So you don't want to eat an understory plant where the produce from that plant is exposed directly to the stormwater, but people feel it's typically safe to eat the produce from trees that are watered this way. Gray water, everybody's got it, and in Arizona it's perfectly legal to use it. There are requirements. Arizona Department of Environmental Quality has an information at their website, and here's an example of distribution of gray water from a washing machine with different outlet pipes going to plumb to different trees. And this is Brad Lancaster's system, and you can find out more about that at his website. Here's his washing machine, and there's the water. When each load of wash they do, they just change the outflow pipe into a different drain pipe to different trees. Of course, you have to use the right kind of soaps when you want to use gray water to irrigate trees. So you can develop your water resources strategy for your site based on these different water sources. Here's a schematic showing water harvesting off the roof, off the broad landscape, from a tank, and from air conditioning condensate, and out the back going from a gray water pipe from the house. And by the way, air conditioning condensate is an important water source. The water is virtually distilled. This is the condensate off your air conditioner coils, and it is typically discharged either to a drain or even outside your house. So this is an example of a drain pipe outside the house that used to just wet the soil at the foundation, which is a bad idea. This particular condensate pipe yielded 36 gallons every 24 hours in August one year. So that is a significant amount of water. Just add a pipe and route it to a nearby tree. Now, when you go to harvest your fruit and your pods, make sure do it safely. There's a lot of different tools you can use to harvest. And then, store, dry, can, process your foods so that you can use them now or at a later time. And here is a harvest calendar that you can get at the LEAF website that tells you the range of harvesting periods in Arizona. It's quite broad because of the different elevations in Arizona. I am doing an extra segment here on wildfire protection for edible trees, and this applies to all trees because it's becoming increasingly a problem throughout the Southwest and certainly in Arizona. This is an example of defensible space diagram. You can get this information at firewise.org. And when you're dealing with edible trees, you want to keep the more flammable ones, junipers, oaks, pinon pines, etc., away from the zones 1 and 2 near your house. So if you already have them, you might want to be either cutting them down or cutting them back. And if you are keeping them, prune them up. Here you see on the right a well-pruned juniper. And make sure when you prune that you clean these branches, that you rake the duff from under the trees and remove it from your site, particularly during fire season. I know we like organic material, but during fire season, it's better to get the dead leaves away from your house. And I speak from experience because I did this trimming right before a wildfire 3 years ago in Sonoyta. And it was a really hot June. There'd been some local fires. I thought I'd better get out there and take care of this. So I started pruning back. And here you see an example of cutting ladder fuel. You don't want shrubs taking the fire up into your canopy. 2 days after I did this pruning, a wildfire swept through the subdivision, burned 5 houses to the ground, and it was fierce. It crawled all the way up to the foundation of this house, but it did not damage this oak tree because the leaves were raked, the understory was removed, and the grass was trimmed prior to this fire. The same thing with horizontal continuity. You want to keep your shrubs at a distance from one another. Once again, the fire came through, no damage to the house. So take this seriously. It's hard. It's a little bit heartbreaking to cut and remove trees, but it's really important. In the orchard, which was very, very, very well watered before this fire, the fire came right up to the perimeter of the orchard. You can see the burned manzanita bush right outside it, but it did not penetrate into the orchard because the soil was very moist. So that's the end of my section. Rafael will do part 2, and we will take questions after both presentations. Thank you.
Okay. All right, folks, I've just launched a poll for those people who are here for CEUs. If you're here for CEUs, if you could just quickly answer this poll while I get the next presentation ready.
If we're not here for that, do we leave it blank?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Okay, last call for CEUs, and I'm going to close that poll. Okay, welcome to the next part of this presentation.
Good morning and welcome to part 2 of our presentation. My name is Rafael de Granade and I'm going to be talking to you about tree propagation, tree planting, tree care, and harvesting in the desert Southwest. Tree propagation. The easiest way to acquire your trees is to buy them from a local nursery. Local nurseries should stock trees that are well adapted to growing in your region. Try to select trees free of any obvious signs of disease, with trunks about 4 to 5 feet tall and 1/2 to 3/4 inches in diameter. You can also order bare root trees. These are trees that arrive without any dirt on their roots, usually in the spring before bud break. You must get them in the ground immediately. I usually put these trees in a 5-gallon bucket of water so the roots can rehydrate, and then either heel them in, which means just to place some dirt over their roots, or plant them in their final place. The benefit of bare root trees is that you can order pretty much any species or variety that you want, and they can come from nurseries all over the United States. I usually have the best luck with nurseries that are generally in my region. So if you're in the West and you order trees from the Northeast, they won't be as well adapted as if you are in the West and you order trees from Western nurseries. You can also plant tree seeds. If you have native trees in your area that you're trying to propagate, find the ones that taste the best, that have the seeds or the pods that you want to have in your yard. Keep in mind that many native tree seeds require special treatment before they will germinate. Some need to be chilled, some need to be scarified, which means breaking the seed coat with a little bit of sandpaper before planting, and some need to be soaked overnight. There are forestry manuals put out by the U.S. Department of Forestry that will tell you how to propagate native trees. Keep in mind that fruit trees are a different matter. Most fruit tree seeds are hybridized or selected over time and will not reproduce true to the parent. For example, an apple tree seed, only one in about 80,000, will make an apple that tastes like the parent tree. For fruit trees, we usually use grafting. Grafting is a method where you splice a known or desired variety onto a rootstock. The rootstocks are generally hardier or disease resistant or adapted to different soil types. You join the two of them, holding the inner bark or cambium together so that they form one tree. You keep that juncture sealed and moist, and then be sure to prune any sprouts that come from the bottom, as these will be from the rootstock and not the desired variety. I'm going to give you a quick demonstration or introduction to grafting, even though it is not for the faint of heart. And I recommend that if you really want to try grafting, go to YouTube and look at several different videos to get the technique accurate. You will need hand pruners, a grafting knife, a sharpening stone, aluminum tags, or I use tin or gutter material, elastic grafting strips, parafilm or buddy tape, grafting wax or sealant, ethyl alcohol, and of course the grafter's handbook. A grafting knife is only sharpened on one side. It has one flat side that you will always keep against the wood. You must maintain this knife razor sharp at all times. It's like doing surgery, so the cleaner and sharper your knife, the more effective your graft will be. I usually use 600 grit sandpaper and a fine diamond hone or stone. The parafilm that we use is from the vineyard industry. It's like a thin, stretchy wax tape that can be wrapped around the union of the graft to hold in the moisture and keep it damp. The elastic strips, you can also use rubber bands, hold the union tight until it can heal unto itself. And of course, the alcohol is to keep everything as sterile as possible. The rootstocks can be ordered by the tens or the hundreds from different nurseries around the country. Usually the rootstock and the variety that you want to graft, or the piece called the scion, are different varieties within the same species. Sometimes you can use different varieties of species within the same genera. For example, plum rootstock works with apricot and vice versa. One exception to this rule is quince, which is Cydonia, is often used as a dwarfing rootstock for pear, which is the genus Pyrus. Make sure before you start working and order your rootstock that there is a compatibility between the rootstock you order and the scion wood you've collected. For example, sour cherries cannot be grafted onto some types of sweet cherry rootstock. One element that the rootstock can control are the size of your final tree. For example, this is an apple rootstock that you can order from nurseries. Bud 9 is a full dwarfing rootstock. It is fairly versatile, but regardless of the variety of your apple, it will keep it in a small, manageable size. The downside of such dwarfing rootstock is because they produce apples of the same size as a normal tree, the trunks are often not strong enough to hold the tree up, and they need to be tied or trellised to maintain their stability. At the other end of the spectrum is a rootstock called EMLA 111 or M111. I use this rootstock most often because it is highly versatile, disease resistant, and grows on many types of soils. But it's slightly smaller than a standard tree, which makes it easier to prune and treat tree problems or spray for moths and harvest. So keep in mind that the rootstock you choose should be selected for your particular area. You can order these rootstocks from a nursery. They're usually 1 to 2 years old and a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch diameter, which you can select. In general, the diameter of your rootstock should match the diameter of your scion material. Heel them into the ground or keep them moist with damp sawdust or coconut fiber until you can graft them. One method of grafting, called bench grafting, is actually done before you plant your rootstocks. You keep your rootstocks in your garage damp, then you graft them on your kitchen table, put them directly back in their damp material, and plant them in spring after the danger of frost has passed. Or before bud break, I guess, is also how I would do it. The rootstocks can also be planted into a nursery bed for a year and then grafted later after they've developed their roots and are growing strong. Either way, either the bench grafting or grafting them in the ground works just fine. For your scion material, select a variety of tree you want to propagate. And the reason I find this so valuable is that you can go around your neighborhood or travel to old homesteads and find the trees that are well adapted to your area. You can also propagate trees that have family meaning, or trees that your grandfather planted, or ones that your neighbor has that has delicious fruit. You have a full option or control over the types of fruit that your tree will produce. This method also works well for what's called top working, or taking a tree that produces fruit you don't really like and changing it into a tree that produces fruit that you do really like. Regardless, your scion material, or the wood from the tree that you want to propagate, should be collected early in spring. I collect my scion wood in January or February. It should be long before the buds start to break open. The best wood is year-old growth that's very supple, and it's usually at the end of the branches. It's wood that was produced the previous year. I try to cut from the periphery of the tree where it's had lots of sunlight. The scion should be roughly the diameter of a pencil. And I cut wood that's about 6 to 12 inches long. Make sure you inspect it for any signs of disease, because that disease you will be propagating or transferring to your new trees. Make sure you label it very carefully with masking tape. And then I wrap my scion wood in moist paper towel and put it in a sealed plastic bag in the bottom drawer of the refrigerator to last months before it's time for grafting. The cambium of your wood should be green when you graft it, and the leaf buds should be closed. If you look at this drawing on the lower right-hand corner, the scion material is that last section of wood with your tight leaf buds. You can kind of see the scar from the year before, and you can see those little sections in between the buds. That's where you'll be working for your graft. So in general, work with very clean tools. Remember, this is surgery, so the tissue as it's cut will need to be clean so that it can heal onto other tissue. Don't touch it with your fingers. Don't set it down in the dirt. Use alcohol on your tools, but not directly on the wood itself. And keep your tools very sharp and dry. The inner cambium is that thin green layer just inside the inner bark, but it's not the woody xylem. So you're going to be working with that thin layer of green that will heal together between your scion wood and your rootstock. The easiest graft is what's called a cleft graft. So you take your rootstock and you chop it off right straight across the top. And then you make a single downward cut in the rootstock. Now in your scion material, you're going to want 2 sloping cuts to make like a triangle of exposed wood. I usually leave the front of this cut, or the side facing you, a little wider than the back so that the scion wood can heal together and doesn't have quite as wide of an exposed cut. Then you wrap this union, so you slide it together and make sure that the cambium, or that inner green edge, which you won't be able to see, is touching between the scion wood and the rootstock. And then wrap the entire union and the entire scion wood in parafilm. Parafilm was that thin, waxy tape that seals in the moisture. And then I take an elastic band and wrap just the graft union, so just the part where I've cut, and keep it tightly wrapped in elastic. Make sure you label it, because in the future you won't know what kind of tree you've grafted unless you label it with masking tape and a permanent marker. After the wood has sealed, or the new union has sealed, you can remove the elastic, and you should remove the elastic after the leaves break out and start to grow. If you don't, it will restrict the growth of the tree. And then I label it with a permanent tag. I use an awl or sharpened nail and scratch into coated gutter material so that that scratched label stays forever. And I take a very loose wire hoop to hold it to the tree. But if the wire's tight, it will grow into the tree and it will permanently damage it. So make sure that your wire hoop is big enough and loose enough that you can use it for many years. This technique can also be successfully used for top working. If you have a tree that you don't like the type of fruit it's producing, take another variety, same species. So if it's an apple, use another apple. If it's a pear, use another pear. And select branches that are about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter. Then you make a clean cut with a knife straight down into those branches. And it's wide enough you can actually slip in 2 of these scion woods and then just prune back the one that is not doing as well. So just leave 1 at the end. And you can rework all of the branches in the tree as long as they're not over 2 inches in diameter. The other type of graft I use often is called a whip and tongue. In this, your scion and rootstock should be similar in diameter. Make a diagonal cut in the rootstock about 45 degrees and another diagonal cut in the scion material about 45 degrees. And make sure that the cuts match nearly perfectly. Ideally, you make 1 cut in both. It's very difficult to get your knife angled correctly and just make 1 smooth, clean cut, but it will heal much quicker if you do it this way. I usually make a little whip, which is a vertical cut that's in the rootstock and in the scion wood, and then you slip these together to hold the 2 so they don't slip apart. Wrap them in your parafilm, then wrap them in elastic, and then the same. Wait till it starts growing before you remove the elastic. At this point in time is when you paint on your grafting, your glue to cover the main joint after it's been healed. And of course, put a tag on it so that you know what it is later when it's growing and older. I'm not going to go much more into grafting. You can learn about chip grafting and bud grafting and several other types, but we're going to move on to planting trees from cuttings. This works really well to clonally propagate some types of trees, specifically pomegranates, olives, and grapes. Again, you're going to take your dormant wood or your scion material or your cutting in February. January through March is the best time before the buds have broken. I have the best luck with pencil diameter cuttings, and make a diagonal cut on I usually use the bottom, but whatever it is you do, make sure you know which side is the bottom and which side is the top. Because contrary to what you might think, it's really difficult to see which way those buds are pointing on some of these species. And I scrape the end of the bottom of the cutting just a little bit to roughen up and damage the skin, or the thin bark and the cambium. And then you dip this in rooting hormone or rooting powder and tuck it into moist soil several inches down. I usually bury about 1/2 to 3/4 of the cutting in a deep pot to give it lots of room to put new roots out. Then I put plastic over the top to keep in more humidity and keep the ground moist. So the ground meaning the pot itself, until the roots have sprouted. I have the best luck if I leave those cuttings in their pot for a whole year. That's why I use a big 5-gallon pot, so there's enough soil for that plant to grow. If you damage the roots too early, your success after transplanting is diminished greatly. You can transplant them into the ground the following year. In the lower right-hand corner are my pomegranates. I have great success with pomegranates. I oftentimes will start them in my bathroom or in the shower, and just try to find areas with higher humidity and don't disturb the roots for many, many months, if not a whole year. Another technique is called layering. This is when you, again, scrape a little bit of bark from a very long supple branch, dust some rooting hormone over it, and then bury it in the ground, and it will grow its own roots to form a tree. Another technique that's quite fun is called air layering. And in this technique, you actually scrape or roughen a section of the branch, dust some rooting hormone over it, and pack it with a moist peat moss or moss, and then wrap it. Again, the parafilm works really well. A plastic bag works well. And then secure the ends and try to drip moisture in over time or check the moisture. And if you have that material moist, it will create roots. And then you can just chop off the branch and plant the branch. That technique works really well for citrus trees. Now planting your trees in the ground. The best thing to do is to clear a very wide basin ahead of planting your tree and get your water systems in. In the Southwest, water is paramount. So I will put in a drip system and, in addition, create terraces or big kind of eyebrow-shaped basins like Anne talked about to catch water on the, so you're catching water that's flowing from the slope down to the bottom. Any land is sloped. Just keep a sharp eye to see which way rainwater flows when it flows or when it falls, and make your basin so that they will catch that rainwater. Again, a big wide basin, at least 3 feet in diameter. And dig your planting hole deep enough to accommodate your roots, but not so deep that the trunk will be buried above the graft union or just too much onto the bark, because the bark will rot. So I then dig a planting hole, and you can mound a little bit of native soil in the bottom of the hole to spread your roots around. And you can see in the diagram on the right that the soil is then filled up to the same level as the tree was buried before you transplanted it. You don't want to go any deeper up on the bark. I sometimes am in the soil, but rarely. My thought is that the tree needs to be adapted to your native soil. And if you amend it too much, you're going to make it root bound. It's not going to want to get its roots out into that difficult soil and make its living there. The exceptions are if you have really tight clay soil, so it will make too much water stay around the roots, kind of waterlog them. And in that case, I usually dig an even bigger basin and incorporate some sand and silt into the soil. The organic matter I usually put on top in a thin layer around the tree. I use manure since we have a ranch, and animal manure is generally, after it's well composted, I will spread it around the base and then cover that with my mulch material, which we use wood chips. So again, spread the roots around the mound, water them in deeply as you plant them to keep any air pockets from being around the roots that will dry them out, and leave a basin around the tree, not deep enough where water will stay up on the tree trunk, on the bark, but so that it will hold the water and let it filter in or sink in slowly down to those roots. I plant trees in the dormant season, which is February and March. You don't want to plant them when there's danger of the ground freezing and the roots freezing, and you don't want to plant them after bud break. The exception to this is one, trees that come in pots. If you don't disturb the soil around the roots, it is possible to plant trees at other times of year. And in the desert where you get strong monsoon seasons, you can also plant especially native trees during the monsoon season, which is July. Keep in mind that if the trees have lots of leaves, July is a really hard month because the evapotranspiration will exceed the rate the tree is able to draw up moisture into its roots. So plant your trees before bud break. Make sure that you dig a wide enough hole, twice as wide as the tree's roots. I don't fertilize young trees because the fertilizer can actually burn the roots if it touches them. Flare out the roots, make sure your graft union is above the ground if you're planting a fruit tree, and compress that soil or water it in deeply so that there's no air around the roots. The final level of soil should be the same level as it was before the tree was transplanted. Mulch your tree basins. You can either use organic mulch, which is wood chips or leaves or desert vegetation. Make sure that it's not up on the tree's bark. Keep it a few inches deep, and I add more mulch over time. I just keep widening that circle of mulch, and as it kind of sinks down, I add more to keep mulch. This will be the key to healthy trees in the future. Not only does it retain water in there, but it also provides a place where worms and other soil microorganisms can flourish and make that tree healthy. You can also use inorganic mulch, which are rocks or sand. Again, you're trying to make a barrier between the sun and the soil that will hold moisture and make it available to the tree. Make sure you keep grass and weeds away from the tree until it's well established, especially Bermuda grass. This is kind of my nemesis here. You need to cut those roots away from where you're planting the tree and then keep the grass down so that it doesn't come up against the tree, and make a place for bugs and rats and other animals to get in there against the tree's bark. Keep a permanent record of where you planted these trees. I like my aluminum or tin tags. I also take GPS coordinates if I'm planting more than 5 to 10 trees, and make a map so that you know which varieties of trees are in your area or your garden. Tree care. Once the trees are in the ground, make sure that you keep them well watered. Again, in the Southwest, water is your limiting element. Water at or outside the drip line. This means don't water too close to the trunk of the tree. And this expands as the tree gets older. So a little tiny tree will have a very small diameter of a drip line, and the water will actually be pretty close to the trunk. Then you can actually run spaghetti tube from your original drip line or move the drip line so that you're watering out, not next to the trunk, but where the rain would drip as it falls onto the tree. Trees do not like their bark wet. It facilitates different types of fungus to grow and can actually kill the tree. How frequently to water? I water deeply, once a week or once every 2 weeks. I don't water shallowly every day because the roots then stay near the surface of the soil where they're more easily dried out or burned from the heat. Especially in the months of April through June before the monsoons come, you want to make sure that your water is long and deep and penetrates as deep into the soil as the roots are. This can be quite tricky to measure, but if you stick a rod in or a stick, you can actually see how deep the soil is moist. And you want to make sure that the water gets very far down into the roots. Adjust the water to the tree as the tree grows. If it's a very leafy, high-producing fruit tree, you will want lots of water as it starts to grow and make more leaves and fruits. Native trees don't need as much water. They actually survive better with less water if they can get their roots down deep into the soil and adapted to the native monsoon and winter storm weather patterns. Again, the water can penetrate or should penetrate at least 2 feet deep for trees that have their roots down deep in the soil. And if you water periodically for longer versus shorter, more often, you will get deeper watering and deeper roots. Feeding. Don't fertilize the year you plant. You can After the tree has started to grow, you can apply fertilizer or compost, and the amount that it needs will depend on the tree's age and the amount of fruit that it's producing. You can add some fertilizer to your water. Native trees can actually add nitrogen to the soil. Nitrogen is a limiting element in desert environments, and by planting your ironwoods and mesquites and other leguminous trees around your yard, you're actually making more nitrogen available to your fruit trees. Adding compost can correct minor soil deficiencies, but use well composted materials. And again, I put it under a layer of mulch so that the sun doesn't burn off the available nitrogen, and your watering then allows it to percolate into the soil. If you do have a soil deficiency, you can always get your soil tested through your local university cooperative extension offices, and sometimes specific micronutrients can be added to the soil or as sprays to the leaves. Thinning fruit. As your trees start producing, sometimes they can produce way too much fruit, and it will never get as big as it could as if you take some of those fruit off the tree to allow the others to grow larger. Stone fruit, remove your tiny fruits after the petals fall and the fruits are large enough to see. Space them about 6 to 8 inches apart. Apples and pears, you want to thin about 30 days or a month after blooming. Apple fruits occur in clusters, so select the largest fruit in each cluster and space the other fruits about 6 to 8 inches apart. Be a little bit careful because sometimes strong winds in spring can knock off fruit and you'll actually get less than you think you would have. Drought can also cause fruit fall or insect damage. However, fruit can, if it's too dense and too much fruit, then it definitely does better if you take some of it off before it's large enough that the trees put a lot of energy into growing it. Supporting branches. How often have people had large branches that crack and fall under the weight of the fruit? Make sure with good pruning that you keep your branches in tight to the tree's trunk. These trees are actually a neighbor of mine who didn't keep his branches in tight to the trunk, but he had an ingenious method of PVC pipe with a T glued on the top and then webbing so that these flexible pipes bend and swayed also with the branches in the wind. If you just prop them up from underneath with a board, the wind will lift the branch, the board will fall, and then the branch will break. Pruning. I prune much more heavily now than I ever did in the past. A pruning controls your tree size. It strengthens the structure and the strength of the limbs. You take off dead wood, diseased wood, crossing branches. It improves airflow through the branches. It allows you to treat the fruit if you need to do so. It distributes sunlight into the branches. It stimulates bud growth, and it renews your fruiting wood to increase your yield the following year. What you'll need is hand pruning shears, lopping shears, which are big, long, heavy shears, and a pruning saw, which usually has a curved blade and wide teeth. Deciduous trees you prune early in the winter or early spring when the branches are bare and the sap is slow so that the wounds can heal. Transplanted trees you prune directly after planting. Remove any shoots below 18 inches on the trunk and shape the tree. I usually cut the tree down to about 3 to 4 feet high so that it stimulates new branch growth at that level and makes for easier harvesting in later years. The first few years, you're training the tree shape. And for mature trees, you're pruning the interior branches and vertical branches to allow more air and sun to reach all of the branches. For pruning, remove the root suckers, which are those at the base. Remove any diseased or damaged wood. Remove any broken limbs. Any limbs that are parallel and going the same direction and prohibit sunlight to each other. Remove crossed limbs. Limbs with very narrow angles. They're actually weaker than limbs that have wide angles. Limbs that shade other limbs excessively. Any water sprouts, which are those very straight, vertical, thin branches that will not produce fruit, and any downward branches that will droop too low to the ground. Pruning methods. Prune just above a lateral bud. That will force a branch out in the direction of the bud. Prune back to the apical growth of the branch. That means you're forcing these buds to make lateral branches instead of vertical branches. Upright branches make the tree grow more. Lateral branches produce more fruit. And always prune back to an outward-facing bud to encourage the tree to grow wider instead of in onto itself. Make very clean cuts within 1/4 inch of the bud. Don't leave stubs on the tree. Use spreaders, which are sticks or different, you can use pipe cut into an angle. It's something to hold the branches apart to create wider angles in these branches. If trees are too large or overgrown, don't take off more than 1/3 of the branches in any one year. To train open trees, my favorite method is the open vase shape. This forces the branches out and makes the fruit easier to harvest and encourages airflow through the tree as it grows. This is called open vase. However, there are other types of pruning methods. One is called a modified central leader, which means you leave roughly 3 to 4 branches in a spiral going around the trunk, or it looks like 5 to 6, and then the central leader where you still keep a main trunk going up and just select which branches are going around this trunk to make a spiraling tree that's growing vertically. This works if you don't have a lot of space, but it does make the trees harder to harvest in the end. Extreme conditions in the Southwest are something we really need to prepare for. Extreme heat and extreme cold. So plant your cold sensitive trees in warmer microclimates around your house. Plant late blooming or cold hardy varieties to get around those very late spring frosts that can kill all of your fruit. Wrap your sensitive trees in blankets to cover them in the winter. Build structures over the trees to cover them with tarps. You can place lamps around the trees. For extreme heat, you need to plant your sensitive trees near hardy trees that can shelter them a little bit. I also use shade tarps for young sensitive trees. When pruning, leave branches that shade the trunk of the tree so that it doesn't get burned by the sun. Also provide them extra water and mulch during the hottest times of the year. Prepare for intense storms by protecting your trees when you know that heavy wind, ice, are coming. Also, if you keep your trees pruned well, they're less likely to receive damage from intense storms. In general, though, I try to select trees, both native trees and hardy fruit trees that are either late blooming or known to be resistant both to local diseases, to heat, or to these storm events. I try to select trees rather than growing sensitive trees that need a lot of extra care. You can also, as we talked about, make structures to protect your trees from both predators and the elements to give them a little bit of an edge until they're strong enough to take care of themselves. To avoid tree problems, keep very diverse systems. Oftentimes that means having chickens or turkeys with your trees. It means having diverse natives and fruit trees growing together to keep a healthy ecosystem. Make sure that you take care of your trees, treat them if they have diseases, prune the dead branches off, make sure to burn or destroy these infested branches, and rake fallen disease branches away from the tree itself. If you do have an insect problem, there are several natural methods of treating insects, but make sure it's really a problem and not just an insect that could be a beneficial insect and is part of this ecosystem we're trying to establish with the trees. Animals are a different story. I always put in a fence along with the water system when I'm planting my trees. Deer, elk, javelina, even neighboring cows, sheep, horses can damage trees immediately to the extent that they might not recover. Also keep your weeds and any invasive species down, especially the first years when the trees are just getting established. If you do have a virus or disease, work with your local cooperative extension agent to identify the disease and treat it so that your tree has a chance to flourish. Again, this is an idea I have called think like a forest. Use several structures in your area. That means plant forbs and lower shrubs as well as your tall fruit-producing trees and natives to have a multi-layered structure. Make sure that you don't shade out other ones, or make sure you're accommodating for the mature diameter and height of your trees when you're creating the structure. Use microclimates. That's both the built environment and your planted environment. Build your soil with compost and mulch. If you're planting all of these trees together, they will start sharing nutrients and creating microorganisms, these soil webs that facilitate health among all of your trees. Make beneficial wildlife habitat that facilitates pollination. Manage your pests carefully and plant different types of trees so that you can have a harvest throughout the year. To harvest your trees, I use, for the taller trees, one of these baskets on a long pole. If you're using a ladder, be careful that you use extreme ladder safety. You can use hand cutters, clippers, scissors. Some types of fruit do not want to be pulled off of the branch. They want to be clipped off of the branch. Over on the right, you see a bag at the end of a rake. They also make bags that you can, with shoulder straps, you can loop over your shoulders not to damage the fruit as you're harvesting it. Fruit can be eaten fresh, canned, dried, candied, juiced, zested, cured, pressed, canned, baked. There are many methods of dealing with fruit to preserve it throughout the year. Again, this kind of prolonged harvest season is something I really try to generate when I'm even in the planning stages of a food forest. So if you have nuts or fruits or seeds or pods, or even some trees have edible flowers, you can select varieties that grow in your area, and even different varieties of the same species can have months different harvesting periods. You can have early peaches, mid peaches, late peaches, early apricots, later apricots, etc. The apples range from early summer, about August, to late fall. Some you harvest in November and they last till spring. So make sure that you're selecting varieties that will give you this harvest for a very long time duration. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, I'm going to put up one more poll for those who are here for the continuing education units. I'm going to leave this up for just a little while, and we're going to move into question and answers. And I've pulled some off of the chat while we've been going along. So Anne and Rafael, are you ready to take questions? Anne and Rafael, are you unmuted and ready to take some questions? Right, let me see. I am not seeing them. Well, let's see. Our first question, and Rafael, if you've got access to chat, you can also just enter the answer to this question in the chat feature. But there was a question about concern from oil that comes from runoff in parking lots and streets being used for water harvesting. And again, Rafael and Anne, I don't hear you on this. So I do know that when you looked at those pictures that Anne had showed of the collection of rainwater, a lot of that was coming from streets, and streets where people were parking. And so there was oil in it. And it seems to work absolutely fine to manage that process. So if anyone has any other knowledge on that, you are, oh, and Anne just isn't able to unmute. So I need to, she just texted me. So let me find.
Can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear
This
you,
is
Rafael. Thank you. Yay, I need to
I'll
find.
just answer,
Go ahead.
I can answer that question briefly. The function of the trees in this instant is actually, the function of the trees and the soil is to filter out those inorganic compounds. So they will stay in the soil and in some cases actually be decomposed by the mycorrhizal networks or the trees themselves. So it's not actually a huge problem and can in fact be a benefit that these basins are collecting oil off the pavement, because then it doesn't have the opportunity to go into groundwater systems.
Okay, thank you. Anne, did I just unmute you? Can you try? I'm looking for your phone number in all this. All right, I think no, that's not you. All right. Stand by. All right. Good news is we have a lot of participants on the line. The bad news is I can't find Anne and all the participants to unmute her phone number. So
Just have her call, Bev, you can have her call in again and she can select unmute at that point, or you can see which number is popping in. And I can answer a couple questions from later in the talk in the meantime.
okay, and all right, I think I found her. Anne, is that you?
This is me. Can you hear me?
Yay! I was like,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. The answer to the question about contaminants in on coming off parking lots, etc. Water harvesting and growing trees in detention areas around parking lots is actually considered a best management practice by the EPA in Tucson, Arizona, to mitigate contaminants in urban environments prior to that water making its way to the regional wash system. So what happens is the microbes in the soil break down those organic-based compounds, and you can see that in that particular parking lot where that photo was, that the asphalt might have been fairly fresh, and there weren't a lot of plants actually intercepting that water. So you were able to see the staining there. But by and large, those byproducts are broken down in the soil. And I haven't seen any intense data about that being taken up into the roots of plants. A lot of native trees tolerate that contamination very well. And as long as you're eating fruits high off the ground or pods and not eating anything that's actually in contact with the stormwater, you're probably pretty safe eating that. I know a lot of people who do eat produce from street side harvesting. Now that was a very large commercial parking lot, so that would have more asphalt byproducts, et cetera, than just a small urban street that's well washed. Did that answer the question, or is there a follow-up question on that?
I think that did pretty good, but I'll keep my eyes on the chat. Rafael, we just wanted to clarify one thing. You'd mentioned to write with an awl or a sharp nail on a tin tag. Is that correct?
My favorite is gutter material. So I will go to the gutter stores around town and request their scrap. And it has a coating over the metal itself. So if you scratch through the coating, you actually can see the label fairly clearly. If you just do it straight on tin, you can get the indent, but over time it's hard to read it.
Okay. All right, thank you. Are there other edible tree directories in southwestern states like Colorado, Utah, New Mexico? Do we know of any?
I don't know of any.
Okay. How about your thoughts on whitewashing trunks? And a follow-up question is, how do you keep trunks from freezing and cracking?
That sounds like
I don't
Rafael.
have. Oh, I was trying to pass it off. I have had issues with trunks being sunburned, and I know that there are types of paint that can, especially white paint, reduce the amount of sun that goes directly to the trunk. The way I just try to make sure that my graft union is facing north so that it's less able to be damaged by the sun, and try to space my trees in the environment so that they don't have a lot of sun exposure. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, well, within the Arizona Community Tree Council, for certified arborists, the best management practice is no painting trunks. So in terms of keeping things from freezing and cracking, I'm not sure what the protection is on that either, but I do know that the painting has gone out of fashion. Let me get to...
Bev, one follow-up on that question about databases in other Southwest states. There is a lot of overlap. You would probably, if you had, for example, an edible tree list in New Mexico, you'd probably have a lot of overlap with the list for Arizona. So if you go to the edible tree directory at leafnetworkaz.org and check that directory, you'll find the elevation range where those trees grow, and that might give you some information about whether they could be applicable in Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico as well. Do you concur with that, Rafael?
I do. I think it's a great idea. And Bev made the website so that you can search based on zone. So we divided Arizona into, I don't know, 4 or 5 zones. I don't remember. But if you're in New Mexico, for example, just exclude the lowest zone, which would be Yuma and Phoenix, and probably all the rest of the zones would apply in New Mexico, and the trees would translate pretty well. It might not be exact for the natives. You'd have a slightly different suite of both species and varieties or subspecies of natives.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up question on watering. In watering in hot, dry months, is that longer and more frequent? Let's see if I can.
I never have enough water in summer for all the trees I planted, so they all just suffer. But to answer that question, I try not to do frequent waterings because frequent shallow waterings make those roots go closer to the surface. So I would do more frequent deep waterings. Always try to keep them deep. I will usually water on my drip irrigation systems either 24 hours or sometimes 48 hours, and do that once a week or once every 2 weeks.
Okay. And one more question here. Can a water permeable weed cloth under a wood chip mulch be used in an urban area when transitioning from a grass lawn to a xeriscape yard?
I would ask your county extension agent about that for your area.
Okay. All right. And there was a comment that Prescott has some particular issues with gray water use, and you'll need to check with Prescott before you start installing gray waters. They've got gray water systems. They've got some very specific directives on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even though while it's legal statewide in Arizona, there are some local restrictions because some of that effluent is being cleaned up and used for recharge. So they're trying to discourage residential gray water use. Also, strictly speaking, the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality rules say you can water the roots of citrus trees. They say that's fine with gray water. They don't encourage it for other edible trees. Brad's system is much broader than that. So just a caveat on that, strictly speaking, they recommend restricting it to citrus trees.
All right, I think I have covered all the questions that were showing up in the chat. If I missed something, if anyone wants to re-chat that in. And I will hand this back over to Jim to wrap up this education portion of our meeting.
Thank you, Bev. I'll be very quick. First of all, this obviously covered a lot of ground. These two presenters, they touched on a lot of different topics. And I hope it inspired you, but I'm sure that it was a lot to absorb. And I do encourage you to spend some time on their website, the LEAF website. It's a really rich resource of information. I also put in the chat box a link to Brad Lancaster's site that Anne mentioned in her presentation on harvesting rainwater. That is also a pretty rich website full of information. And I included a link to his TED Talk because I find that really entertaining and interesting, Brad Lancaster's TED Talk. I noticed that several cooperative extension folks or state forestry agency folks were on this call. And Rafael mentioned briefly that they can be a resource, cooperative extension folks. I definitely encourage you to reach out to your local cooperative extension service agents or to your state forestry agencies because they have a lot of local knowledge and local expertise. So I really hope this inspired you to get out there and try some of these things that you heard about, planting, thinking about different species than you may have thought about, maybe trying your hand at grafting or propagating from cuttings. Definitely, these are really rewarding things to do. There's lots of great examples of it working well in this region. And so finally, I just want to thank the two speakers, Audrey and Rafael de Granat, the various organizers, including Bev, Early Bev, and some of the others who reached out to help with CEU credits. And all of you attendees, I really appreciate your attendance, your interest, the questions you had. I would also like to encourage you to think about staying involved with the SWAN organization if you'd like. I did put the website on a little while ago, and we meet regularly. In fact, we're going to meet right after this. We're going to have a business meeting here in just a second. You're welcome to stay and join that if you'd like. But we'd love for you to be involved in SWAN, to stay engaged with us. We hope to have other programs like this periodically. So thank you all. And again, thank you to the organizers and to Anne and Rafael, our speakers.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Bev. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
Yep. So now we're going to have just maybe a couple minutes and then we'll jump into our business meeting for those who want to participate in that.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording so that, and we will be posting this to our SWAN website, and I will send out a link to this recording as well for everyone who attended. So thank you, and you are welcome to stay for our business meeting.